Euthanasia passes second reading in the UK and anti-discrimination in Canada once again. My name is Jonathon Van Maren. This is the Bridgehead briefing, and those are the stories that we'll be covering today. Euthanasia in the United Kingdom. It has passed second reading by a not significant margin, actually. It's looking a lot better than it was a while ago. But on November 29, when news reached the crowd gathered outside the UK Parliament that they had voted in favor of assisted suicide, there was people in wheelchairs weeping openly. Carolyn Farrow, who is a pro-family activist, was among them, and she said, "The atmosphere is one of profound sadness and terror. A dark cloud has descended over the UK." And there's a good reason for that, because every single one of the more than 350 disability rights groups in the UK had opposed what was called in Orwellian terms the Terminally Ill Adults or End of Life Bill. And 330 MPs had ignored all of those more than 350 disability rights groups. Now, disability rights activists are used to being ignored, but this time was different. Now, it is second reading, not third reading, so this bill is not yet law. It has not yet received royal assent, and that's good news, and I'll get to that in a minute. But if this bill ends up passing third reading, it passes the House of Lords, and then receives royal assent, November 29 may prove to be the darkest day in UK politics since the Abortion Act, which received royal assent on October 27, 1967. And there's a lot of parallels between these two bills. I'm not the only one who has noticed this. Both of these bills, of course, sanction the taking of human life by medical professionals. It's a radical reorganization and re-envisioning of what the medical field is all about. Both of these bills are championed by politicians and activists who insist that the killings will be rare. And this is obviously untrue, and yet the lie is repeated over and over and over again. In 1967, when the Abortion Act was being debated in Parliament, Tory MP Jill Knight, who passed away several years ago, was loudly mocked for accurately describing the kind of society that the Abortion Act would create. And she was mocked at and sneered at by parliamentarians who claimed that she was fear-mongering and that the Abortion Act would only be used in very rare cases, because that's always how these things are defended and then legalized. But since 1967, there's been more than 10 million abortions in the UK. More than 10 million preborn children killed by abortion. Jill Knight was right, and they were wrong. But of course, none of them ever apologized, because one really does get the sense that those who claim these things will be rare will not care and do not care if it turns out that they were wrong, that they actually already know that they're wrong, but at the same time are advocating for something because they think it's a good thing, not something that should be rare. And if something is good, why should it be rare? Because when the suicide activists and the euthanasia activists were defending this bill, they lied so frequently it was almost impossible for those of us who were trying to rebut their claims to keep up. I'm on a number of different chats and in communication with many different anti-euthanasia activists across the Commonwealth and across the UK, and the sheer volume of deceit that was pouring out of activist groups like Dying with Dignity was hard to keep up with. And again, when the UK parliamentarians defending this bill claim that it will be used in very narrow circumstances, they're ignoring all of the examples that we actually have. I did a previous episode on horror stories coming out of Canada's euthanasia regime, which come out almost weekly at this point. The horror stories coming out of the Netherlands and Belgium, where in Belgium recently somebody was actually suffocated with a pillow after doctors and nurses realized that the lethal injection hadn't worked the way it should. So the slippery slope is not actually a fallacy. It's a demonstrable inevitability. And we can know this by looking at what's happening in Canada since 2016, by looking at what's been happening in the Netherlands since 2001, by looking at other countries such as Belgium. And again, I just think that it's increasingly impossible not to conclude that those who are championing assisted suicide don't recognize that this is taking place. And one of the things that's important to note about the rhetoric here is that they're desperately trying to avoid actually discussing what is in the bill. And backbench MP Kim Ledbetter, she's the one who put forward this bill to begin with, although she was supported by Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the UK's first self-confessed atheist prime minister. She had to retract deceitful statements during the parliamentary debate on November 29, including having to retract from the record a statement that the majority of the judiciary supported her. She had to retract that. And at one point, Danny Kruger, an MP who stood up and made a magnificent speech condemning assisted suicide and condemning the kind of society that this bill would create, for calling it suicide, he had MPs jeering at him and claiming that he was using extremist rhetoric. And so the crazy thing here is that they're trying to bring in assisted suicide. And yet to even call it suicide makes people respond with accusations of fear-mongering, even though that is what it is. We are talking about doctors killing their patients. We are talking about doctors injecting poison into the veins of a patient to end their life. End-of-life care already exists. It's called palliative care. This is proactively ending the life of a patient with a lethal injection. But suicide activists recognize that if they call it suicide, that will lose them support. And so they have to pretend that they are not defending what they are in fact defending, which is why they called it the Terminally Ill Adult End of Life Bill instead of the Assisted Suicide Act. And assisted dying, by the way, is not a recognized medical phrase, and it first became mainstreamed here in Canada when Canada first put forward its own bill in 2016. Let me emphasize for a moment why disability rights activists are so terrified of this new legislation. And disability rights activists are a very ideologically diverse group. They're by no means conservative per se. And it's because the UK's abortion regime, and this is an important point that almost nobody has brought up, is explicitly eugenic. So in the UK, abortion is banned at 24 weeks. You cannot get an abortion past 24 weeks. And at the time this time limit was set, it's because that was perceived as viability, even though viability is further back now as science has allowed us to keep children, premature children, alive earlier and earlier. But if you discover that the child growing inside you has Down syndrome or has a cleft lip or has a clubfoot, then you can get an abortion all the way up until birth. In other words, the government has said abortion should be cut off at 24 weeks. But if your baby has a disability, then open season is permitted right up until birth. So somebody can go and abort a feeling, kicking, thumb-sucking baby at 8 months if they discover that that child has Down syndrome. This is an explicit statement made by the government about the worth of children who have Down syndrome. And in fact, Heidi Crowder, a young woman with Down syndrome, challenged this eugenic exception in court some time ago. I wrote about it at the time, but a judge ruled in November 2022 that the Abortion Act, quote, did not interfere with the rights of the living disabled. Again, such Orwellian language. So right now, the UK government already proactively affirms that those with disabilities are inherently less valuable and that, again, open season on the disabled in the womb should be permitted right up until birth to allow parents to take them out for a longer period of time. And so the Abortion Act has already enshrined a fundamentally eugenic regime in the UK, not only enshrined in legislation, but recognized by a judge as recently as 2 years ago. And this is why disability activists are so terrified of this assisted suicide regime, because they recognize that an assisted suicide regime does not mean that everybody has freedom of choice or autonomy, which is the way most parliamentarians are selling this bill. What it means is that the government is going to proactively decide whose life is worth living and whose is not. We know from Canada, the Netherlands, and Belgium that this eligibility criteria always expands because there is no limit to assisted suicide as a right once you enshrine it as a right to begin with. But the government has to decide who is eligible for this state-sanctioned suicide service, despite the fact that MPs didn't like the state sanctioning a suicide service and therefore claimed that it wasn't about suicide at all. But when the government decides who is eligible, they are making a call. They are deciding whose life is worth living and whose life is not worth living. And if you want to know who the government thinks has a life worth living and who they think does not have a life worth living, all you have to do is look at who is going to be offered suicide prevention and who is offered suicide assistance. If you are offered suicide assistance, medical aid in dying as they call it in Canada, the government has confirmed that your life is not in fact worth living, and therefore they will both fund and facilitate your human right to die at the end of a needle. Whereas if you are not eligible for assisted suicide, you instead will receive suicide prevention, and it's actually illegal for you to take your own life because the government has decided that your life is worth living and you were not permitted access to this so-called human right. So this stuff is passed on the pretense of autonomy and choice, but who this choice and who this autonomy is offered to is extremely indicative. And that is what disability rights advocates are so afraid of, because they know where this is going. They know where this is going because we've been here before. It's why the government has decided that after 24 weeks, a baby in the womb has an inherent right to life and is valuable, and you will be prosecuted for trying to kill that baby. Several women have been prosecuted in recent years under the Abortion Act. But if the baby has a club foot, therefore maybe it will have some difficulty walking, or if that baby is diagnosed with Down syndrome, then that baby has no value whatsoever, and therefore you are allowed to have that child decapitated, dismembered, and disemboweled right up until the moment of birth. So again, the ableism, the eugenics, it's baked right into the system, and this is the next manifestation of it. So the entire assisted suicide debate, it was littered with propaganda, outright lies. Again, as I mentioned before, the backbench sponsor, Kim Ledbetter, was responsible for most of them. In fact, even the constantly cited public support for the bill was a straight-up mirage, because a poll found that when people were actually told what the bill would mean, support plunged from over 60% all the way down to 11%. And this is just a reminder that polls are not taken to gauge public opinion. Polls are always taken to instead shape public opinion. This is what Noam Chomsky referred to as manufactured consent. And Dying with Dignity has been trying to manufacture consent for months now. They were putting up hundreds of ads on social media, pouring vast piles of cash into mainstreaming this. As one anti-euthanasia activist put it in The Spectator after the vote, Yuan Yizu, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he said, ahead of the vote, Dying with Dignity, flush with money, advertised on a massive scale. They plastered Facebook with ads. They covered the walls of the Westminster Tube Station, that's the subway station, with posters showing people jumping in joy to celebrate being able to kill themselves. There is at least one suicide attempt every week on the underground network. Dying with Dignity knew that this vote was their best shot at legalizing assisted dying this century, and they held nothing back. And so it's interesting to note, actually, that Dying with Dignity's original name was the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, which is grim but at least more honest. They have, of course, changed their name, just like they insist that the NHS, the National Health Service, will not be implementing a national suicide service, although that's precisely what's going on here. So despite all of this, 4 former prime ministers, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, former Labour PM Gordon Brown, and Theresa May, all opposed the bill. To their shame, David Cameron, who hasn't gotten anything right in his entire career, Rishi Sunak, whose career was blessedly short, and Keir Starmer all supported it. Even the Church of England stepped up with over 1,000 members of the Anglican clergy, including 15 bishops, signing an open letter. So it was refreshing to see Anglicans taking a moral stance for a change. Cardinal Vincent Nichols and other prominent Catholic clergy have been vociferous in their condemnation of the bill. Chief Rabbi Sir Ephraim Mervis published a long opposition to the bill on November 26. And additionally, 3,400 healthcare professionals, including 23 hospice medical directors and 53 eminent medical professionals, signed a letter stating that Ledbetter's bill would, quote, threaten society's ability to safeguard vulnerable patients from abuse. And just to give you an idea what a joke this bill is, the same day the House voted by a majority, so 330 voted for it, that same day they voted against moving forward with funding for a children's hospice. And the medical system, including the National Health Service, has stated they do not have the palliative care available to help dying people, which means that for many people, assisted suicide is going to be the only thing they're actually eligible for at all. They're not going to be able to get a hospice bed. They're not going to be able to get palliative care. So the only thing they can get is a lethal injection. And we've seen how this unfolds in Canada. And it is impossible for me to believe that most of the MPs did not know what they were voting for. But I promised to end on an encouraging note, and I will, because thankfully the die is not yet cast. According to the Independent, 36 MPs who voted for the bill stated that they could be persuaded to change their minds at third reading, saying they only voted for the bill to continue the debate. And we only need 28 MPs to change their mind in order to defeat this bill at third reading. As Dan Hitchens of First Things noted on X, there will no doubt be more. A few MPs switched to a no vote in recent weeks, plus there are 18 who did not vote on Friday, sat the debate out. So we have all to play for. UK medical doctor and pro-life activist Callum Miller concurred. He said, "This is really important. The euthanasia fight is actually far from over. There are enough undecided MPs to protect the old and sick, protect the soul of the medical profession, and protect life. Let's keep fighting." And the British press is already reporting on a plan circulating amongst anti-suicide, it's hard to believe I have to use that phrase, parliamentarians to do just that, talking about killing the bill at the committee, loading it down with amendments. Fortunately, we lost a significant fight on November 29, but the fight is not yet over. And so I actually thought the words of the British poet Dylan Thomas seemed appropriate here. "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should rave and burn at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." Canada continues to shift towards the anti-Christian age, and there are several recent stories that are worth noting. Some of you might ask, why am I covering all these seemingly small individual stories about the removal of Christianity from the public square and increasing anti-Christian sentiment amongst institutions and politicians? And the reason I think it's important is because very often we look at these small stories and we think, these stories aren't actually that big of a deal. Who cares if this happens over here or that person got censored over there? This person could have moderated his or her language a little bit. They didn't need to be so controversial. And so then we miss the forest for the trees. We look at all these individual incidents and we don't see the broader cultural shift that's going on. But as I've been pointing out on my book tour, which I've been doing across Ontario over the past weeks, what we're seeing in almost every Western country is a shift from societies based on scriptural revelation to the principles of sexual revolution. So first, let's take a brief look at a story from Newfoundland reported on by the National Post. There's a good ending to this story, but the fact that it even is a story, I think, is important. So let me quote directly from the National Post here. "Thanks largely to an outcry from the public, Newfoundland's largest mall reversed its decision to prohibit the Salvation Army from fundraising in the shopping center this holiday season and in years to come due to its religious affiliation. We have heard from members of the community and recognize the local impact that the Salvation Army collection campaign at the Avalon Mall delivers each holiday season," property owners Crombie Raitt wrote in a statement to the National Post. Lieutenant Colonel John Murray said the Protestant Church, an international charitable organization, is deeply grateful for the Canadian real estate firm's change of heart in welcoming the iconic Christmas Kettle campaign back to the St. John's Shopping Centre. As first reported by the CBC, Crombie said it informed the Salvation Army earlier in the year that it had made the difficult decision, I'm sure it was, to step away from partnerships with religion-affiliated groups, by which they mean Christian groups. Unfortunately, the message didn't get to the Salvation Army's St. John's chapter, so Crombie decided to allow one last year of fundraising this season. The decision was made with considerable ire, with many on social media urging others to voice their opposition and calling for a boycott of the mall. "I won't be doing any Christmas shopping in the Avalon Mall unless they take back this decision," Debbie Nofdahl commented on a Salvation Army Facebook post. "Maybe it's time for the people of Newfoundland to stand together and make a difference. Let the Avalon Mall owners, Crombie Raitt, know that we will not be standing for their ignorance to what they are doing." So a lot of people were pointing out the Salvation Army, again, is a charitable organization that helps anybody who needs it. They provide an enormous amount of food. In fact, they run one of the only food banks in St. John's, Newfoundland. They have 900 families who go there every single month, and especially in tough economic circumstances in Canada, it's really, really important that they're able to continue to do so. But why, you might ask, would a group like the Salvation Army even become controversial to begin with? Again, it's because institutions are getting the impression from the government that Christianity is controversial. Because Canada is increasingly post-Christian and fewer people know what Christianity actually stands for, it's become a lot easier just to sideline Christian groups altogether. And that's both because of the government, but it's also because if you read a story about a Christian group or a Christian charity or a Christian church in the mainstream press, whether it's the CBC or almost any of our major Canadian newspapers, it is almost always going to be a story about the conflict between some Christian institution and the sexual revolution. So you don't read stories about the Salvation Army feeding 900 families every single month in St. John's. You're not going to read a story about the big food drives that churches do or the enormous amount of community work that, say, Redeemer University does every single year. You will hear, however, stories that break the shocking news that a Christian church still holds to the principles that Christian churches have held to for 2,000 years. And so because a tiny minority of Canadians now attend church on a regular basis. I've mentioned the stat before, but a poll from the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada found that only 11% of Canadians attend any form of worship monthly, which means that for most people, their only interaction with what the Christian faith actually stands for is going to be what they read in the press. And what the press is going to tell them is that Christian groups are just anti-abortion and anti-LGBT and all of that they're intolerant, that they're discriminatory, ignoring the fact that Christian groups actually do the vast majority of charitable work. And in fact, the number one way to tell whether or not you're going to get donations from somebody is an examination of their religious beliefs, as all of the data tells us. So this story, it's a small story, and it has a happy ending to it, but it's culturally significant, and that it's one more small piece of evidence that Canada is shifting towards a more anti-Christian perspective. And there's another story, again, from just the past couple of weeks, and that is the story of a Nigerian Canadian named Comfort Sakoma-Fadugba. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She's the former vice chair of the Vancouver Police Board. But she has been asked to step down from that position and has, after she posted comments to her social media decrying the deliberate removal of Christian values from Canada's public square. Because when Canadian progressives talk about inclusion, you can be sure that Canadian Christians are about to be excluded. So when progressives talk about inclusivity, they expect people to understand that this means aggressively celebrating physical differences while aggressively enforcing ideological conformity. So Comfort was hired in 2022 to the Vancouver Police Board, and at the time, the board celebrated her impressive background in expanding equity, diversity, and inclusion in all aspects of life. There's a social media post where they're kind of boasting about how there's this woman of color, she's got a DEI background, but unfortunately, she seems to have made the mistake of being too inclusive and assuming that the word all meant, all, which is not what it means in Canada in 2024. And so when she made a post on her social media talking about the systematic erasure of Christian values from the lives of our children and noting that they are being replaced by those of a new dominant group, she had no idea what was coming. She cited the example of her son being asked to participate in a Hindu Diwali celebration at school, and she emphasized that she has nothing against Hinduism per se. She emphasized that, quote, "What I want is for Canada to remain true to its own roots, rooted in its unique values and identity, which has always made us who we are. And that as such, Christianity should remain dominant. That is the core identity of the country." And she said, quote, "We need to move past the woke culture that has led to the removal of Canadian heroes like Terry Fox from our passports and the erasure of veterans from the same. It's time to return to the moral fabric of Canadian society." Now, as sad as the story is, it was a little bit funny for me to imagine people at the Vancouver Police Board reading this comment and thinking, like, we hired somebody who's an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has a background in DEI, and now she's posting this, which in 2024 is clearly far right and truly horrifying. To say that Canada has a core identity is obviously heresy, because Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as I've mentioned before, said in 2015 that Canada has no core identity, by which, of course, he means that Canadian Christianity has largely been erased, or at least this is an aspiration of progressives like himself. And so Comfort was immediately condemned by fellow Vice Chair Frank Chong, so he's appropriately diverse as well, in a statement on November 22, and he has clearly absorbed the lessons of DEI more thoroughly than his female counterpart. So here's what he said. Recent statements posted on social media by the Vice Chair of the Vancouver Police Board do not reflect the values of the board and are inconsistent with our code of conduct. While I value the many contributions Comfort Sakoma-Fadugba has made as a member of this board since 2022, these statements have made her continued service on the board untenable. This afternoon, I requested and received Comfort's resignation from the Vancouver Police Board, which is an appropriately banal way to fire a woman of color from a position on the Vancouver Police Board for not being inclusive enough or diverse enough. And so she responded on social media as well, noting a troubling undercurrent of suppression that stifles free expression. Freedom of speech is often touted as a fundamental right, but it comes with invisible chains that bind those who voice dissenting opinions. Many find themselves silenced by fear of backlash and vilification. And she noted that while 20 media platforms covered the story, only 2 of them reached out to her for her own perspective. Of course, that's because they're not interested in her perspective. And she concluded, I faced pressure to resign from the Vancouver Police Board for expressing concerns shared by millions, including the national leader of the Conservative Party. This reflects a broader issue where legitimate concerns can lead to repercussions, eroding the foundations of our society. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to the hundreds of Canadians from coast to coast who have sent me messages of support. Your encouragement means the world to me. I love this country and will fight for it because my son deserves to grow up in a place where everyone can thrive authentically without fear of persecution. In a place where even a black woman can be accused of being a racist and a Christian woman labeled a fascist, what hope do others have to raise their voices? Now, that's a good question. But the reality is that Comfort is discovering what it means to be a Christian in Canada in 2024. Persecution? No, not yet, although I couldn't help but think the fact that a Canadian woman of Nigerian origin would use the word persecution is somewhat chilling, considering that Nigerian Christians are currently undergoing a slow-motion genocide in that country, and she is very obviously not unaware of what that word can mean. What we are seeing is a systematic scapegoating. All religions can be celebrated, Diwali, Ramadan, except for Christianity. Why? Because Christianity is our core identity, but Canada's progressives don't see Christianity as our core identity. They see it as our original sin, a source of suffering and intergenerational trauma, as the Department of National Defence put it a couple of years ago. And so for Canada to rise, in their opinion, it must emerge from the ashes of her former Christianity and, of course, her smoldering churches. And so one of these stories, pushback resulted in a change in policy. And the second story, obviously, Comfort is out of a job because she wasn't the kind of inclusive that progressives intended her to be when she got hired. We'll keep track of these stories because these stories, again, they're anecdotal, but these anecdotes, when taken cumulatively, show a trend of Canada from post-Christian into anti-Christian. Thanks so much for joining us on the Bridgehead briefing today. If any of you have any stories that we should cover, please drop a comment below. If you have any vigorous disagreement or heckling you'd like to do, please drop those comments as well. You can find our content wherever you download your podcasts. And if you found this content helpful, please do share the video or like it. Thanks so much for listening.